Welcome back. Now that we know we can choose a player start, we need to know which player start to choose. And if we just created a new character slot and we're loading in for the first time, we should have a default player start. And we're identifying these by the player start tag, which is really just an F name. Now, if we're loading in a fresh new character, let's say we go to the load menu, we press play, we click new game, we put our name in, we choose new slot, right? Well, as soon as we select that slot and click play, we know we're going to the first dungeon. Well, that first dungeon, that map, is going to have a player start that we designate as a starting point, but it isn't necessarily the only player start in the level. In our case it is, but you may wish to have multiple, and you may wish to spawn in at the designated starting point for that dungeon. Well, in that case, we need to know what that player start tag should be. And if we press play and we go to that dungeon, we're now loading in. All actors are calling begin play for the first time, including the game mode. And the game mode is not going to know which player start to choose. It needs to know that right away because choose player start is called quite early in the level. So we need to figure out what we want to do, whether we want to load in that data from disk or what. Well, we don't actually have to load in that data from disk. We can save it to any class that's persistent from level to level. And one of the fundamental classes that is persistent from level to level is the game instance. If we have a game instance and we set a property on the game instance, such as a variable we add to it for the player start tag, then we can check that in any level that we load into. And whatever it was set to last, that's the tag we can use. So I'd like to make a custom game instance class, and I'll start with the C++ side of things. We're going to go into Aura public game, and let's make a new C++ class based on the game instance. Now we can go to all classes and search for game instance. And here it is. It's just game instance. We're going to select that and call this Aura game instance. So this can go in the game folder. Let's create this class and go ahead and close down our editor. And Aura game instance is going to be quite simple. It's going to store any persistent data that we want to persist from one level to another. And that can be our player start tag. It can also be our slot name and index if we want to load in data from disk once we get to another level, which we will want to do that. So we're going to go into our new class in public game Aura game instance, and we're just going to put a couple of variables in here. It's not going to be very elaborate. We're just going to have a public section. And first of all, we're going to want a F name called player start tag. And we're going to give it a U property. And in addition to that, I'd like an F string called load slot name. Now, we can start these as empty. I'm going to make this one an empty F string, and I'll make player start tag an empty F name. And these are all getting U properties. We want them participating in the garbage collection system. And I'll have one more that's an int32 called load slot index. And this will be 0. So the player start tag, that's obvious why we would want that. If we load into a new level, we want to know which player start to choose, right? And the load slot name and slot index allow us to load in data from disk, because when we load data from disk, if we look at Aura game mode base, we can remind ourselves how that's done. Get save slot data calls load game from slot, passing in the slot name as an F string, and the slot index. That's how we identify saved slots. So our game instance can know this. As soon as we've loaded it in the load screen, we can set this on the game instance. And then when we load into a new level, we'll know which data to load in from disk. But for now, we're just concerned with the player start tag. We're going to set that, which means we're going to need to have a default player start tag that is designated for any players that have just created their character. They've just created a new slot. there needs to be a default slot to set this to. So we need to set this player start tag. And we can start by going to our load screen view model, because as we go and create a first slot, our new slot button pressed is called. Right here, we need to specify that first player start that we should load into. In other words, we should get our game instance and tell the game instance what the player start should be. And while we're at it, we can tell it what the slot name and slot index are. So down here at the bottom, let's get the game instance. It's going to be Aura game instance. We'll call it Aura game instance. Now I need to include this type. So we'll go ahead and add an include for it. And we're going to call Aura game mode get game instance. And because this returns just a game instance, we're going to cast. So we'll cast to Aura game instance. And as long as we're using the correct Aura game instance, this should be a valid pointer. And we can take Aura game instance, and we can set its load slot name. Because we have our slot, we have load slots indexed with slot, and it has a slot name. It's called load slot name. And we can set Aura game instance load slot index by getting our load slots of slot and getting the slot index. And then we can set the player start. And the player start, which we called player start tag, needs to exist in our first level. So that's something we can keep track of where we're setting that first level, that default level. That would be on the game mode. So if we go into Aura game mode base, along with a default map name and a default map, we can have a default player start as well. So this can be an F name called default player start, and we'll call it default player start tag. And we'll give it a U property, edit defaults only, and we'll have to set this in the game mode. And now we can use this in MVVM load screen. We can set Aura game instance player start tag equal to Aura game mode default player start tag. Now our player start is going to have the proper value when we've created our first slot. Now that we're going to be setting that Aura game instance player start tag, then our Aura game mode base can get that tag from the game instance and choose player start. What we can do is first thing get our game instance, which we're already getting in load screen. It's this line here. We can use that in Aura game mode base up here. We do have to include Aura game instance, but we also don't need to use Aura game mode because we're in the game mode here. So we can just get game instance. Now we have Aura game instance here, and when we're checking the player start tag, we can check it against Aura game instance player start tag. And whatever that player start tag is set to, that's the player start that we'll start at. Now we can test this out. We can run in debug mode. And we have a couple things that we need to do right away. First, we have to go to our game mode class. And I'm going to go into the game folder and open BP Aura game mode and set that default player start tag right here. Now, it's going to be for our first dungeon. So I'm going to call this Dungeon 1 Player Start 1. And that's the tag that we're going to set on our game instance, provided that we're now using the Aura game instance, which we need to make a blueprint for. And I'm going to do that here in the game folder. So new blueprint, Aura game instance. We'll choose that, call this BP Aura game instance. And we're going to make sure that our project uses this game instance. Let's go to project settings and search for game instance. And here's the game instance class for our project. We need to now choose BP Aura game instance. Now we'll be using that. And now we should be able to load in at the correct player start. And just to remind ourselves, if we look in BP Aura game mode, we named it to Dungeon 1 Player Start 1. I'm going to copy that. And I'm also going to make sure that Load Screen Game Mode has that set as well. So that way when we retrieve it from the game mode, we'll get the correct value. Now we just need a player start that has that tag. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this player start and move it on over to here and give this player start that tag, Dungeon 1 Player Start 1. So now this level has a player start with that tag. Now, here's the thing. We have to save all and go back to our load screen, our load menu, and we have to press play and delete these slots. We have to make a new slot because as soon as we create that new slot, that's when that player start tag will be set on our game instance. So I'm going to call this Steven. New slot should be first dungeon. If we select it and click on play, now I go over to the correct spot, our correct player start way over there. So we saw that we loaded in at the correct slot, right? But the game instance only gets that player start tag set whenever we create a new slot. If we come back in, select the slot, and press play, well, we don't get spawned at that player start tag because we're not actually setting the game instance player start tag to that. What we need is a way to keep track of what our last player start was. So if we're loading in for the first time, this is fine. Over here in MVVM load screen, when new slot button is pressed, that's cool. We can set our player start tag on the game instance to the default one. But we need a way to save where we last were. So whenever we exit the game, for example, we need to save our last player start. So we need to figure out when exactly we should save our last player start. In other words, we need a sort of checkpoint fname that we can save. So this is great that we're setting our game instance player start tag the first time we create a slot. But what about when we select a slot that's already existed for a while? We're going to need to save our last player start that we were at. In other words, we need a sort of checkpoint player start tag, and that way when loading in a saved slot that's not brand new, we'll know what to set our game instance player start tag to, and that's something we'll do in the next video. So great job, save your work, and I'll see you in the next video.